Okay. Today we're going to be learning Ketubot Daf Zayin. Where'd it go? Okay. Today's daf is sponsored by Nina Black for the Refuah Shlema of Devorah Bat Leah, and today's daf is sponsored by David and Mitzi Geffen in loving memory of Azriel Geffen, Azriel ben Avraham Zichrono Livracha, on his 69th year at site. Okay, before we start, quick announcements. I'll remind you again, like I said yesterday, the Zoom will be taking a break, just the Zoom. The regular shiurim will go up as usual. They'll go up a little earlier than usual, in fact, a few hours earlier than they normally go up. So that will be starting. Still, we have time. I'm just kind of warning people. Starting on July 24th, already Sunday morning, there will be no shiur until around August 25th, something like that. I don't remember the exact date, but when I'll be starting again, somewhere right around there. Okay, another announcement. We opened again the registration for bookmarks. So if you haven't gotten bookmarks, we have great bookmarks that we had a nice staff that worked on collecting main musagim terms for each masechet of Nashim. So if you haven't gotten them yet, it's free of charge. We'll mail them to you. So you can register till either Sunday or Monday of next week. Okay, the 17th or the 18th. Make sure to register by then, and we'll do another shipment of bookmarks probably the week after. Okay. Starting our daf. So let's go back very briefly to Hey Amabet. On Hey Amabet, we had a question. Mahu liv'ol b'tchila b'Shabbat. Are you allowed to have relations? A man, can he have relations with his wife for the first time, assuming she's a virgin, on Friday night? And then we had a whole question, is how do we view the blood? Is it like it's in a pool, collected, and we're just kind of letting it out? And then the issue would be, are you building an opening, which would either be bonet or it would be makebe patish, putting the final blow. And then we said, but even within that, you could call it davar she'eino mitkaved, or you could say it's makalkel, it's destructive act. It depends who you hold by and those issues. Or do we say that you're actually doing a chabula? Really, the blood is in the blood vessels. You're basically cutting, you're making a tear, which is causing the blood to come out, which would be a problem of chabura, which is a toladav shochet, of slaughtering. And then again, but maybe that's not your intent. Maybe it's destructive. Again, we had a whole debate. So we then saw that Rav, according to one version, permitted and Shmuel forbade. We saw a different version that was the flip. Then we went into that first version and asked a question of Rav, resolved it. Then we asked a number of 3 questions on Shmuel. Said, how could you possibly forbid? We see all these sources seem to say permit. And in the end, we answered up all those sources. That's what we did. That all started from Hey Amabet. We're still on this topic. So our daf starts off with Rabbi Ami. We're on the second line, and now we're going to basically start going through different rabbis and what they held, kind of like we saw Rav and Shmuel. Now we're going to see again different rabbis held different things about this. Rabbi Ami shara lemival b'tchila b'Shabbat. So Rabbi Ami permitted this kind of thing, meaning again, you get married on Friday, have relations for the first time on Friday, no problem. Amrei le Rabbanan v'halo k'tiva ketubata. But wait, there's no ketubah written yet. Okay, now this is strange. Don't you write the ketubah before the wedding? So it seems from here that there was custom to sometimes, or maybe in some places, they wrote the ketubah after the wedding. Now, you can't really be married without a ketubah. In other words, you can get married without a ketubah, but you can't live together without a ketubah. So presumably they would write it in the evening after the wedding was over. To which, right, seems like a weird thing to do after your wedding, sit down and write the ketubah. On the other hand, to do it before your wedding is also, right? It's right, because you're talking about in the event of death or divorce, it's not exactly pleasant to be doing this after you've already married. On the other hand, theoretically, it's a little strange to do it before the wedding. Wait till you see what we're going to do in this case. So the Gemara says, well, they didn't yet write a ketubah, so now you're stuck because you can't write a ketubah on Shabbat. So what are you going to do? Amar Lahu, he said to them, At pisua metaltalin. Oh, now if you think it's strange to start writing a ketubah after your wedding, this is even more strange. What does she do? What is a ketubah? So there's all different elements of the ketubah, and we'll get to them as we go on through this masechet. But one of the main elements of the ketubah is that the husband is committing money to the wife in the event of death or divorce. So what do they say? If, let's say, you got married on Friday afternoon and you get home and Shabbos has started and you can't write a ketubah, so theoretically you can't be together, but comes the Gemara, the Rabbi Ami, and he says, have her just grab some of his possessions, his movable possessions, because she can't grab his land, but grab some movable possessions and take them for herself. And then she has like a collateral, so that if he doesn't give her the ketubah, at least she has some hold, some lien on something of his. So, right, imagine the night you get home, she says, wait, before we do anything, I have to make sure I've got some of your property just in case something goes wrong, right? Not exactly what you want to be thinking about at that moment. But on the other hand, right, you can't live together otherwise. So this is the solution. Rav Zvi, Shari Lemival, you see how they come up with creative solutions that might seem a little bit strange, but at least resolve halachic issues. Rav Zvi, Shari Lemival b'tchila b'Shabbat. Rav Zvi also permitted it. Not only that, some people say, Rav Zvi gufe ba'al b'tchila b'Shabbat. He himself had relations with his wife on Friday night. Why people were talking about this is a very good question. But you can imagine that when he was teaching the halacha, right, it's very often teachers like to teach and say, oh, that happened to me. So it could be he was teaching them and he said, in fact, I did also. Okay, which, it's a little bit revealing some things that are private. On the other hand, if you got married on Friday, then it's not okay. Everyone gets married on Friday and then, it's kind of obvious what's going to happen next. Rav Yehuda Shari Lemival b'tchila b'Shabbat. Rav Yehuda also permitted having relations for the, I read it wrong. Shari Lemival b'tchila b'Yom Tov. He permitted it on Yom Tov. So now the question becomes, when he says it's permitted on Yom Tov, are we talking about specifically Yom Tov or Yom Tov and Shabbat? And it seems weird if he meant Yom Tov and Shabbat, why would he say Yom Tov in general? There are certain halachas that are more lenient on Yom Tov. The question is, why would this be one of them? So now we're going to have a machloket about this halacha of Rav Yehuda, and did he mean Yom Tov only, or did he mean Yom Tov and Shabbat? And it's going to be a debate between Rav Papi and Rav Papa about what Rav has said. This happens very often. The Rav Papi and Rav Papa, who are two students of Rabba who happen to have a name that sounds very similar, they often debate what Rava actually said. And everybody hears what they want to hear or hears what they think they're going to hear. So, or could be Rava changed his mind and one heard one and one heard the other, right? We don't really know. So, Amar Rav Papi Mishmei de Rav, Lo tema b'Yom Tov d'Shari hab Shabbat asul. Don't say that what he meant to say was on Yom Tov it's permitted, but not on Shabbat. Do adin afilu b'Shabbat nami shari. It's also permitted on Shabbat. So now you have to explain, well, why did he say Yom Tov? Well, he said on Yom Tov because he was talking about a particular case. Case before him, somebody said, can I get married on Erev Yom Tov? And he said, yes. So that's why he said Yom Tov, it's permitted, because he was just saying it happens to be. You want to get married on Yom Tov? Well, it's permitted. Rav Papa Mishmei de Rav Amar b'Yom Tov share b'Shabbat asur. No. This is only permitted on Yom Tov, he said, not on Shabbat. So Amalei Rav Papi, the Rav Papa. Rav Papi, you thought that it's on both, says to Rav Papa, I don't understand. My datek, why do you think that this is permitted only on Yom Tov and not on Shabbat? Is it because you hold? Why would possibly we permit this kind of thing on Yom Tov? Normally, what do we permit on Yom Tov? Things that are what we call ochel nefesh, right? That need for food purposes. This isn't for food. So there is this concept in Yom Tov that says, mitoch shutra chabura letzorech utra nami shelo letzorech. Is it that you're holding? Because we permit, okay, let's say, for example, we permit lighting a fire for food. So maybe we'll permit lighting a fire for some other reason. That's what's called mitoch. Mitoch she'utra, because we permitted it on Yom Tov for one purpose, we can permit it even if it's not for the purposes of Yom Tov. So since a chabura was permitted, when is a chabura permitted? What is a chabura again? It's injuring, right? And what's it a toladav? Hashochet, slaughtering. You're allowed to slaughter animals on Yom Tov to eat. So since you're allowed to slaughter animals, theoretically, then you should be allowed to do any of the toladot of hashochet, even if it's not letzorech Yom Tov specifically. If that's what your opinion is, and that's why you think that it's permitted only on Yom Tov and not on Shabbat, because remember, that's what Rav Papa said. So Rav Papa says to him, is that the reason? And Lameata, according to what you're saying then, it should be mutav la'asot mugmar b'Yom Tov. And we know it's not. What's mugmar? They would put coals that had a smell in them. They would burn them up in order to have the clothes smell better. They would put them near the clothing to have a better smell in the clothing. Okay, so if we say that burning is permitted for the sake of eating, then we should allow burning for the sake of making this mugmar, right? And making the clothes smell good. And we know that that's not permitted, right? Since lighting a fire, right, transferring a fire would be permitted, then hutra nami shelo letzorech. Then it should be permitted also shelo letzorech. So Amalei, alecha amarka, ach asher yachel lechol nefesh, davar shavet lechol nefesh. Why is the mugmar not permitted? Because not everybody needs this. When we say ochel nefesh, it means two things. One is ochel, right, for food purposes, but it's ochel nefesh. Why nefesh? It has to be something that people in general, right? There's other things that we permit on Yom Tov. For example, the whole thing, can you shower on Yom Tov, right? Especially if it's a hot day, people shower on a daily basis. That's something that's across the board, right? People, it's a need of people. So therefore, he's going to say, therefore, the mugmar is not permitted, whereas having relations with one's wife is something that people generally do. It's something that's shaveh l'chol nefesh. So that will permit, whereas having clothes that smell good, apparently not everybody cared about that. Okay, there wasn't such a, they weren't as conscious about those things in those days. They weren't so careful about it. So Amalei Rav Acha Berei Rav Rav Ashi. Wait a minute. If you're going to say only things that are shaveh l'chol nefesh, that's a good question. Elamayatan is demein lo tzvi b'yom tov. Not everybody ate deer. So now, let's say you find a deer on Yom Tov. Does that mean you can't slaughter it because not everybody eats deer? Okay, you can think of a lot of things like that, right? Certain foods are more delicacies maybe, or some people don't like them. So Amar le ana davar, right? Nobody ever says food that you eat on Yom Tov is only food that normally people cook, right? Nobody says that. So he says, ana davar tzorech l'chol nefesh kamina. Tzvi tzorech l'chol nefesh. He says a deer is tzorech l'chol nefesh, either because he thinks most people eat deer, or he's just saying tzvi comes in the category of food. And food is something that's necessary for every human. And therefore, that's going to be permitted. And again, that's how Rav Papa supports his claim, which is also an interesting claim, saying that having sexual relations is basically something that's shaveh l'chol nefesh, which is why we're going to permit it on Yom Tov, but we're not going to permit it on Shabbat. And again, it goes to this mitoch shu'utra, chabura l'tzorech, we're going to allow it also shelo l'tzorech. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi. Hora Rabbi Yaakov, we're continuing now in these halachot of people who permitted or forbade this. So Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Hora Rabbi Yochanan b'tzaidan asur levo b'tchila b'Shabbat. So far we've seen everybody kind of lining up and saying it's permitted, other than Rav Papa in the name of Rava, who said only on Yom Tov, not on Shabbat. Now we're going to see the Rabbi Yochanan forbade. We're going to see two versions of Rabbi Yochanan. In one, he simply just forbids it. That's going to be the second version. But in this version, it says that he taught it, hora. Okay, hora or hore, he taught it. What does it teaching usually mean? We're going to see what Rashi said. Okay, let's read the question, then we'll explain through Rashi. Umi ika hora'a li'isur. Generally, when you do a hora'a, a teaching, it's usually to permit and not to forbid. Why is this? I mean, I could teach lots of things, right? I could teach something that's permitted. I could teach something that's forbidden, right? A teaching doesn't mean I was teaching, just teaching you something of interest. Teaching means I came out with a ruling, okay? Now, Rashi says here, what's the question? There happens to be a bit of a debate about what this question is, but we're going to go with Rashi. Most commentaries follow this opinion, which is some people have a bit of a different girsa in the Gemara and have a bit of a different reading, which you'll see why, because it's a bit of a strange question. But Ichal Ra'alisu, okay, where Rashi says that. Umi kari isur hara'a, would you ever call forbidding something a teaching? Not really. Why not? Mishum de kol adam, it's a very fascinating thing in general, okay? Kol adam rashai lahachmir. But everyone can just be machmir. To forbid something is very easy. You can just say, I don't really know, so I'm just going to forbid it. That's not a hora'ah. What's a hora'ah? We'll see in a minute. It's not like you're saying, oh, I have what to rely on to say, I'm forbidding this. You don't need anything to rely on to forbid. Forbidding is easy. You could just say, okay, I don't know, let's just forbid. Because if you're not sure what the halach is, we're going to be more strict usually. Aval hamatil, but when you're permitting something, somech al shmuato, he's either relying on a tradition he has, and then that would be a hora'ah. You're saying, I am teaching this. I know for a fact that it's permitted because I have a teaching. I have a tradition about it. Oh, asfarat chokhmato. Or he says, I've thought about this a lot, and I know that this is the truth. V'hi hora'ah. Hora'ah means you've come to a clear conclusion for however you got to there, right? Tradition or logic, that this is permitted. That's generally hora'ah, not to forbid something. To forbid something is easy. You don't need a hora'ah for that. You just say, listen, we don't know what the answer is, let's just forbid. So that's the Gemara's question, to which the Gemara says, I know what you're talking about. Of course, you can have a hora l'isur. I'll show you 2 examples. In v'hatz, yes, in fact, it's true. V'hatz nan, it says in the Mishnah. I'll give you some background before we read it. Heleni Amalka, her son went out to war, and she said, if he comes back safely, I will become a Nazira. Okay, I'll become a Nazir for 7 years. What happened? She was living, so her son comes back safely. She becomes a Nazir for 7 years. What's the problem? She was living outside of Israel. Now, the rabbis claim, now a Nazir can't become Tamei Lamed, impure to dead people. And if they are, they have to start from the beginning. If you remember, it says that in the Torah. We read it not so many weeks ago. Now, she went back to Israel. And when she got back to Israel, so I forgot to mention, the rabbis forbade and said that Eretz Ha'amim, any place outside of Israel, has tumah, impurity, and basically you're impure. So because of this rabbinic decree of what's called Tumat Eretz Ha'amim, which we've seen in different places before, because of that tumah, basically, we're going to see that she basically has to redo her Nazirut, or at least it's a question, does she or does she not, right? Because do we say, look, it's only rabbinic, this tumah, and she's clearly, she was a Nazir, it's not a problem, it wasn't tumah on a Torah level. Or do we say, no, the rabbis made it tumah, so you basically have been impure. Now that you're in Israel, become a Nazirah for another 7 years. So that's in fact what Beit Hillel said. You see why I couldn't have read this line without the explanation. You wouldn't have known what we were talking about, right? So he says, for another 7 years when you get to Israel, that's a hora'ah, and that's le'esol, to forbid her. V'inami, or another option, kiha detanya, as it says in a Braita, this is all about what makes an animal a treifa. What's a treifa? It's when an animal has some sort of injury or disease. That means the animal's not going to generally, we'll see there's different opinions when we get to chulin, but generally the animal won't make it for approximately 12 months, it won't live out the year. Then if you do a kosher shchita, it's not valid. You can't, the animal's not kosher. That's what we call a right? Treif comes from there, treifa. So chut hashidra shenifsak berubo, if you have the backbone, I can't think of the word, the vertebrae, shenifsak berubo, that the spinal cord, thank you, just couldn't come up with the word. The spinal cord that gets severed, the majority of it is severed, that's a treifa, that's divrei Rebbe. Rabbi Yaakov omer afilu niked, even if there's a hole in it, forget it, doesn't need to be severed. Even if there's a hole in it, that's obviously the stringent position. And here comes our hora'ah. Hora Rebbe ki Rabbi Yaakov. Rebbe, even though he disagreed with Rabbi Yaakov, in the end, he ruled like Rabbi Yaakov, hora'ah, and it was l'chomra, it was stringent. So there you see it. Amar Rav Huna. This, by the way, is just, so now we basically knock out this question. How could Rabbi Yochanan have given this hora'ah about not having relations on the first night, for the first time on Friday night? How could it have been a hora'ah if it's l'isur? We see sometimes a hora'ah is l'isur, even though Rashi explained to us why we would think it's not, but in fact it could be. To which we got off on this tangent about the treifa. So in case you're curious, Rav Nachman Amar Rav Huna ein halacha ki Rabbi Yaakov. Even though Rebbe ended up holding like Rabbi Yaakov, Rav Huna later said we don't hold like Rabbi Yaakov, and if it just has a nekev in the spinal cord, it's not a problem. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak matni hachi. Now we have version 2 of Rabbi Yochanan. Version 1 was that Rabbi Yochanan hora li'isur. He gave a ruling to forbid. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak had a different version, which had nothing to do with hora'ah, in which case we don't have any questions. Amar Rabbi Abaye said the following. He tells a story. Sha'al Rabbi Yishmael ben Yaakov de Minsur et Rabbi Yochanan bet Saidan. It also happened in Saidan. Rabbi Yishmael ben Yaakov from Tzur went to Saidan. These are places that are now in Lebanon. Ve'ana Shame. And I heard when Rabbi Yishmael asked him the question about our issue. Ma'u liv'ol b'tchila b'Shabbat. So Rabbi Yishmael asked him, can you have relations for the first time on Shabbat? V'amar lei asul. And he said, no, you can't. And then it wasn't a hora'ah. He just answered a question. Okay, either which way Rabbi Yochanan forbids, that's the main important thing. Comes the Gemara and tells us, in case you're curious, right, this sometimes the Gemara speaking, it's usually often a later addition that kind of got into the text of the Gemara. So Gemara, as you know, doesn't usually paskin halacha, but here at the end of the sugya, it says, in case you're curious to know, mutar livol b'tchila b'Shabbat. you can have relations for the first time on Friday night. This is good. I'm invited to a wedding this Friday, right? I mentioned it already. It's funny to be learning this week and going to a Friday wedding, which is not the most common of things, although in Israel it is more popular because it's a day off. Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Zavda, Amar Rav. Now we're going to move on to a different topic, very interesting topic of Sheva brachot. Okay, everything, all you want to know and need to know about Sheva brachot is going to be in these next dapim. So these are the brachot. Let's just go through a basic wedding ceremony. I'm going to ignore all the different customs that happen. I'm going to talk about the main parts of the wedding. Number one, you start under the chuppah, right? And we do the berkat ha'erusin or the berkat kiddushin. That in olden days, right? In the times of the Gemara, they used to do that a year before. That was what we call erusin or kiddushin, where there's a blessing, you say, and then the husband gives her something, right? A ring, it could be a star, which we don't do anymore, a document, and says, right, it could have been bi'ah, right, which we don't do anymore. The rabbis already said we learned in Yevamot, definitely not recommended. And they, right, which means having relations. But he basically says, Hare at mekudeshet li, right, kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. We say b'tabatzo, right, whatever it is, you're mekudeshet to me. That's the kiddushin. That's betrothal. Then we read the Ketubot. Why do we read the Ketubot? Not because you need to read the Ketubot, to make a separation between the erusin, or the kiddushin, the betrothal, and the marriage, which is the Sheva brachot. Okay, so we split it by the reading of the Ketubot to remember that back then they used to do this as two separate things, and also not even just to remember, but to delineate them and show we're doing two different things here. Because, and we'll see, we'll talk about what the stage of kiddushin is at the end of today's daf when we get to a brachot type sugya, which is what is the language that we say? What kind of bracha is it? And how do we say it? And how do we start it? How do we end it, etc.? So Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Abba bar Zavda, Amar Rav. Okay, they pass all this down in the name of him, until they get to Rav. Achat betula ve'achat almana tuna bracha. The Sheva brachot are both for virgins and non-virgins, right? You have to remember, every time they say almana, they don't necessarily mean widow. They mean any woman who's already been married, or theoretically, it could just be she's not a virgin. They all need these Sheva brachot. Rav Huna really say this. Rav Huna says, no, an almana doesn't need a bracha. So how did Rav Huna quote in the name of Rav that almana needs a bracha? And in another place, he says she doesn't. Lo kashya kam b'bachur shenasa almana, kam b'almon shenasa almana. Now they say, well, it doesn't only depend on her. It depends on her and who she married. If she married someone, now notice some of the, like one of the Sheva brachot says, Mesamech chatan ima kala, has to do with the happiness of the chatan with the kala. So the focus is on the happiness also of the chatan. So they say, if the chatan has already been married, then it will be different than if the chatan was never married. If the chatan was never married, then you say Sheva brachot. If the chatan was already married, second marriage for both of them, then you don't say the Sheva brachot. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, I got married at a second wedding and we did Sheva brachot, or I was at a second wedding and we did Sheva brachot. So hold off. We're not yet at halacha l'masa, okay? Beginning yet. We're just starting the sin. So now they say, wait a minute. If ve'almon shenasa almana, lo, in almon that marries an almana, you don't say Sheva brachot. V'hamar Rav Nachman, Amar li Huna bar Natan, Tana, minayin lebrachat chatanim b'asara. How do you know that brachat chatanim is said with 10 people? It doesn't say men here. I want to point this out. There's a whole, even though you'll see the pasuk does relate to men, okay? But it's a whole big question, particularly nowadays. I don't think there was such an interest in this topic many years ago, but can women be part of the minyan for Sheva brachot? Can women say Sheva brachot? Okay, there's a whole question about this whole thing. I'll just leave it as an open question. I don't know enough about all the details. I will say that the simple reading of the sugya does seem to indicate 10 men, but there are those who try to claim otherwise. So it's a very interesting topic. It's good to know that there's movement in that direction of counting women where there is room to be counted. And within Orthodoxy, obviously not within Orthodoxy, there people have made room already. In Orthodoxy, not as forthcoming. It's a little bit more complicated. Anyway, I'm just putting it out there. So, how do you know they need to be said in front of 10 people? Who is this? Boaz and Ruth. Okay, now if you remember, there was a whole bunch of things going on there. It wasn't just they were getting married. First, they had to deal with the chalitza, right, of the Ploni Almoni. And they go through that. So they go in front of 10 zkenim. Now, theoretically, you could say maybe it was for the chalitza, not for the wedding. But the point is, it was a wedding. In a second, we're going to say it was also a second marriage for both of them. Okay, we'll see where we get that in a minute. But the point is, you can't say it's chalitza. Remember, chalitza only needs 3, or I think there was even an opinion 2. Okay, you don't need 10 men for chalitza. So wasn't for that purpose. So they say here, you see, they took 10 people from this Kenat year, and they said, sit down, and they did. And Boaz almon shenasal manava. And it was a case of a widow marrying a widow. How do we know he was a widow? So there's 2 sources that show it. One is a midrash that comes up in Baba Batra that says that Boaz was Ivtzan, who was a person mentioned in Sefer Shoftim in chapter 12, and he had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and it seems this must have all happened before he married Ruth. That's one. Then they say another source is that it was also that the day Ruth comes to town, there was a whole big hullabaloo in the city, and they say it wasn't because she was coming in, it was because the Midrash says that his wife had died that day. So that was another source that indicates that he was a widow. Again, neither of them are in the text directly, but they do, the Midrashim seem to say he was an alman. So they say, he was an alman shenasal almana. What do you see here? He needed 10 men. Why do you need 10 men, right? And the whole source for Sheva brachot came from him, right? Obviously, the brachot aren't mentioned there. But the assumption is, why did he gather 10 men? Because he needs to say the Sheva brachot. So, my enatu una bracha. So now we have to go back and explain. I see someone already wrote this in the chat. I specifically didn't mention it yet because I wanted you to see how the sugya develops. But my enatu una bracha de amar Rav Huna. What does it mean? It doesn't need, right? You don't need a bracha for an almana, like an alman shenasal almana. It wasn't talking about the ones under the chuppah. Enatu una bracha kol shiva. Aval yom echad tuna bracha. You don't need it for all 7 days of Sheva brachot. But for the first day you do. So now let's just talk about when we say Sheva brachot. We say Sheva brachot twice at a wedding, once under the chuppah. That's really what we thought we were talking about. Then in the meal after, you also say it. So it seems from here that if you're an alman shenasal almana, you would do Sheva brachot at the wedding under the chuppah, and you would do it at the meal at the wedding. After the first day, okay, or let's say you got married in the morning and you had a meal that evening, it would sound, well, maybe that evening depends. Halachically, it would probably have to be the same day. So if you had an afternoon meal. But all the rest of the Sheva brachot, the 7 days that we call Sheva brachot, right? We call them Sheva brachot. Why do we call them Sheva brachot? Because it's really Shivat Yemei Mishken, the Gemara, they're called, right? 7 days of celebration after the wedding. We're going to see at the very end of today's daf, where it talks about panim chadashat. If you have someone new that wasn't at the wedding, then, and you have a meal, and there's 10 people there, generally we say 10 men, then you make Sheva brachot. Okay, you say these blessings. Those blessings are not said, even if you had 10 people, even if they were panim chadashat, all that, unless, right, if it was an alman to an almana. That's what they're saying is the difference. Okay, so now we have a question. Wait a minute. What did we learn a few days ago? Wait, it says that the rabbis were very careful to make sure that the husband was happy with the wife for 3 days. By the way, in the context of this, it reminded me that Gefet went up late last night. Might be daytime, might have been daytime for you. A very interesting Gefet about the 3 opinions of the Shakdu, where it was really the other Shakdu about having 3 days before the wedding to prepare properly for the wedding feast. There was the reason of the betul, right? Why betulani seit liyom revi'i, the bracha l'dagim, and the obvious one in the Mishnah of Tana Betulim. And there's a good analysis in Gefet this week from Rabbanit Shimoni about these 3 reasons and what they have to say about marriage in general and the purpose of marriage, right? That there seem to be multiple purposes for marriage. Okay, so anyway, I'm not going to give it all away. You can listen. It's a short shiur up on our site. So now they say the following. If you're going to say that the rabbis insisted that she get married on Thursday, so she has Thursday, Friday, and Shabbat to be happy with her husband, well, now we're a little bit stuck because we said an almanah either has 1 day or has 7 days. Nobody ever said 3 days. So we're going to ask now, B'mai, what case is this for what kind of almanah? A widow marrying a non-married, a man who's never been married before, or a widow marrying a man who's been married before? If it's someone who's, they call him a young man, right? A bachor is a young man, but what they mean is someone who's never been married. Hamar Shiva, you said you need 7 days. Iba Almon, Hamar Yom Echad, didn't you say 1 day? So now what they're going to do is differentiate between Simcha and the Sheva Brachot. They're going to say these are two different things. So you can answer it, it's talking about either one. You could say it's talking about a man who was already married before, a widower. Yom Echad libracha u'shlosha l'simcha. 1 day is for the Sheva Brachot, 3 days is for the Simcha. What's the Simcha? Husband has to stay home from work. That's not the same as Sheva Brachot. Those are two different things. You might have thought they're connected, but they're not. A second option, if you're talking about it with someone who is unmarried, Shiva lebracha u'shlosha l'simcha. Again, since she's an almana, they get Sheva Brachot all week because he's a bachol, but since she's an almana, he only needs to stay home from work to keep her happy, make her happy for 3 days. Now we're going to bring a question starting from Amud Bet now. Meitive, mivrachim betulah shiva ula almana yom echad. But it says the betula gets 7 days and an almana 1 day. So my lava filo almana sheniseit lebachol. In other words, it sounds like any almana. It doesn't matter whether she's marrying a widower or she's marrying someone who's never been married. La'almon, you could say when it says la'almana yom echad, it means if she's marrying a widower. To which, again, a widower could be widower or divorcee or anything. It just means it's not his first marriage. Aval lebachor mai. So wait, if you're going to say it's only to a widower, and then if she marries someone who's never been married, it would be 7 days. Well, then that brayta really doesn't make much sense. Or really should be alman, right? In other words, if it really was distinguished, if the halacha distinguished between a bachor and an alman, it should have said so. If not in this source, where is it going to say it? This source divides between 1 day and 7 days. It should have put all the 7 days on the 7 day side and not just a betula. It should have said an almana that marries bachor. To which the Gemara says, no, milta psik tatane, deleka betula debatzam shiva, beleka almana debatzam yom echad. They were just trying to say what's definitive. What they're saying is there's no almana that's less than 1 day. Almana minimally needs 1 day. Could be more, but minimally 1 day. And a betula minimally gets 7 days, right? Also maximally, but basically 7 days is, there is such a thing as Sheva Brachot. It's actually not Sheva Brachot. I'm not going to get into that right now, but we'll get there later about the special benching. There's something special you say in benching even after, but that's a side. That's not Sheva Brachot. So basically what they're talking about here is what you can say definitively that there's no distinction, which is definitely she has at least 1 day. She might have more, but that they weren't discussing. It's a weak answer, but it's an answer. Gufa. Now we want to go back to this source that he brought about the source for 10 people at Sheva Brachot. And we're going to see again, anytime you want to say Sheva Brachot, you need 10. Okay. Sometimes you have a wedding with less than 10. It could be done. Okay. It's not ideal. We've had some weddings in our house where people wanted a very quiet wedding. They didn't want 10 people, and you can do it. Normally we try to figure out a way, we bring 10 people, even if the couple doesn't have their own 10 people, but it happens in our house. We end up with these weddings here and there. So anyway, it can be done, but really you're supposed to have 10 people. So now, Gufa. Let's go back to this line that we mentioned in the context of trying to figure out an alman shenas almana. Really, there's no Sheva Brachot. Why do we learn the source for Sheva Brachot then from a case like that? To which we answered, right? Everyone agrees Sheva Brachot, the wedding and the first day happens, no matter what. So Amar Rav Nachman Amar Lihuna Barav, we're basically Gufa, right? That means we're going in depth into this. We're just quoting what we saw before. Tana minai lebrachat chatanim basara, shenamar v'yikach asara anashim v'ziknei ha'ir v'yom hashvu po. That's what we have. Rabbi Yavahu brings a different answer. And then we're going to have a ping pong. What does he do with that one? Why doesn't he say learn it from that source? He brings a different source. Mehacha, from a pasuk in Tehillim, b'makelot baruchu Elohim, Hashem mimakor Yisrael. In big gatherings, they blessed God from the makor of Yisrael. What is the makor? So the makor is the root of the Jewish people. Often the word makor refers to the womb of the woman. Now, what does the womb of the woman have to do with this? Well, why are you getting married if not for pruruvu? Again, one of the purposes of marriage anyway is to have children, not the only purpose. And that's what you can go to Gefed and hear all the different purposes of marriage. But Makor Yisrael is how we get to the rechem of the Jewish people is through marriage. So therefore, they connect this verse with marriage. That's what Rabbi Abaye says. And what does it say? B'makalot, with a kahal. Kahal is learned in a different place as being 10 people. Okay, that's learned also from the Meraglim, another section. Anyway, because the Meraglim were 10 people, when it says, right, go away from this Eidah Azot and Eidah Azot from a different place. We'll get to the whole thing about where they get 10 from minion in another source. We've actually done it before. Anyway, I don't want to spend our time on it today. So they now say, that's the pasuk. So we have one pasuk from Ruth and one pasuk from Tehillim. So Rav Nachman, the high kad Rabbi Abaye my darashve. So what does Rav Nachman do with this pasuk? He learned something else entirely, which is a good question why you would want to learn this, what the purpose of this drasha is. He needs it for the following brayta. And he didn't make this up. Rabbi Meir said this. How do you know that even the fetuses in their mother's wombs sang Az Yashir? Okay, when they went through the Red Sea. Shene'emal b'makelot brachu Elohim Hashem mimakor Yisrael. From the womb of the mothers came the song, right? People were singing from the womb. Okay, I think it's really trying to say how great a miracle it is and how much hakarat hatov there was, right? That even the fetuses understood what was going on and praised God. Again, this is obviously a midrash, right? Not meant to be taken literally. You can think about what the purpose of this midrash is. But in any case, he learned that pasuk having to do with something else. So what does Rabbi Abaye say about that? If that's what the pasuk wanted you to say, Ida, what does Rabbi Abaye do? Im ken lemakami beten. Okay, by the way, there's psukim like, for example, B'terem atzartech b'beten yidaticha. Before you were even in the beten of your mother, I already knew, right, that you were going to be destined to greatness. So, my mimakor al iskei makor. Specifically, it says makor have to do with iskei makor, which has to do with the woman specifically, not the fetus, but the woman, and therefore, right, why beten and makor would refer to different things? Good question. But in any case, they're saying the fact they use the word makor has to do with the woman, and therefore has to do with the wedding, and therefore has to do with Shabbat. Rabbi Abaye, what does he do with the 10 people in the Boaz ceremony? Why did you need 10 people there? He gets off on a totally other topic. We saw this in Yevamot, right? That they needed to prove that he can marry Ruth because Ruth was a Moabiyah. And in general, the Torah says you can't marry people from Ammon and Moab. And they had to make a big public declaration. Now to explain, we're darshaning this pasuk only referring to males and not to females. Females are permitted. If you thought it was about a bracha, I can prove to you, and of course it doesn't have to do with Shabbat brachot. Why? Lo sagya delavs keni. You wouldn't need the elders there. Why did I say they gathered 10 of the elders? They could have gathered any 10 men, would have been fine, or maybe any 10 people, right? Depending on what you hold about that. But the point is, you certainly don't need them to be elders, right? No one ever said at a wedding you have to have 10 knowledgeable rabbis or something. Ve'idach, what does the other opinion say? Says if you want to say this was to teach you, if I'm learning in the Beit Midrash and I come up with a drasha and I want to teach it, I don't need to get a minyan of people to hear me say it. I can say it in front of anyone. They didn't need to say Amoni v'lo Moavit or Moavi v'lo Moavit in public. To which they said, of course they did. They needed to make it public so that everybody would know. And Shmuel says to Rav Chana Bagdata, go get me 10 people. This is a totally different topic. But he said, go gather me 10 people. And I'm going to tell you in front of all these other people. It's funny, it's a totally different topic, but it's going to end up talking about fetuses again. This is apropos Roe versus Wade. Okay, what does this say? If you give a gift to an unborn baby, that is a kinyan. That belongs to that unborn baby. That's what Shmuel said. Okay, on what basis does he say this, and why would someone think not? Well, first of all, let's just see for a minute. Hilchata, again, the Gemara is going to tell us a halacha here. Hamizakelu bar lo kana. By the way, this doesn't work. Okay, you give a gift to an unborn fetus, it's not relevant. Why? Because a fetus is davar shelo ba'ala olam. It's not in the world yet. If it's not in the world yet, then he can't acquire anything, or he or she can't acquire anything. That's the halacha. What does Shmuel think? So there's two options of what Shmuel thinks. Either he thinks an ubar is ba'olam. That's why I said it's very apropos of Roe versus Wade. Where do you put the ubar? Is it in this world or is it not in this world? Okay, it's a very good question. It's a question that not only troubles people today, but they were dealing with this question way back when. Many sugyot that grapple with that question. Or some people say Shmuel agrees that it's lo ba'al olam adayin, it's not in this world yet, but you can still you can be mizakeh, you can do something that's good for someone, even if they're not yet in this world. Maybe similar to Zachim Adam Shelo B'fanav. You can do something good. We just saw this at the end of Yavama, even if they're not here physically. Okay. So maybe it's similar to that. There's two different ways to understand Shmuel's psak. In the end, we don't hold like him anyway, but interesting to understand. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to where do we do the brachat chatanim and when? Mivrachim brachat chatanim bebeit chatanim. Okay. At the chuppah in the house of the chatan. Basically, it means at the chuppah. That's when you do it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he says you even did it at the erusin, okay, the engagement, which was a year before, which seems a little strange to us. And it seems a little strange to them. Also, Amar Abaye, Abaye comes and says, Ubi Yehuda Shanu. He must have been talking about in Yehuda. In Yehuda, okay, generally they would have the erusin the year before, and then they wouldn't live together for the whole year. They would only live together after the marriage. But in Yehuda, they wanted them to get to know each other better and develop the relationship better. And therefore, they let them do yichud together, alone in a room. Now, because of that, you never really knew what transpired, and you never knew what might transpire. In other words, here they had to kind of do the balance. On the one hand, they wanted people to get to know each other better. On the other hand, like it's hard to do that with everybody around. So they wanted to have some private time together, but they also didn't really want them to have relations. But in the off chance that they might have ended up having relations before, so they would make the brachot chatanim earlier, basically. They would do it at an earlier stage so that in case something happened, they'd already have done the brachot nisuin. So normally we don't do them, right? But in the custom in Yehuda, they would do it. We'll talk more about the custom in Yehuda further on when it gets mentioned in the Mishnah. Tanya Ida. Another brayta says, that makes a lot more sense, right? The bracha of the erusin would happen at the erusin. The bracha of the chatanim would happen in the beit chatanim. This is the brachot type sugya. What was the wording of the blessing? And here we get the text. So you might say this should definitely be the absolute text. Well, not necessarily, because there's different versions of this text of the Gemara, and that leads to a few minor variations among different edot, different groups of what exactly the bracha is, what they say. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav. God commanded us with his mitzvot. It sounds like a bracha mitzvah. V'tzivanu, and commanded us ala arayot, who we can't marry. V'asar lanu et arusot, not only arayot, relatives that we can't marry, but also even when we're engaged, right? The woman becomes forbidden to everybody. Before the engagement, she's really theoretically permitted to anybody. The erusin forbids her to everybody, including the chatan. V'hitir lanu et hanisua. Only when they become married do they become permitted. Why mention this in the brachot erusin? So some people actually don't have these words, which makes sense, because why are we talking about that? Well, otherwise, you're basically saying this is just a description of what's going to happen, and how it works. Al yidei chuppah v'kiddushin, right? They become permitted by the chuppah and the kiddushin, right? The combination of factors permits. Rav Achabarei de Rabba Messiah B'Mishmei de Rabbi Yehuda, he would finish it off with another blessing, Baruch atah Hashem HaKadosh Yisrael Yidei Chuppah V'Kiddushin, which is a basic classic bracha where it starts with the Baruch and ends with the Baruch. That's what you call a bracha with a chatima, with an ending. Man de lo chatim, those who don't have an ending, meaning there was a debate, do you end with a Baruch or not? Midi d'havi, a bracha d'perah, a bracha d'mitzvah. They view this like a bracha on fruit, or a food bracha, or a mitzvah bracha, where you just say, right, la litnir shel Shabbat, right? It's one bracha, no ending, right? And this is very interesting. Do you view this like Kiddush? Now, why Kiddush? Well, first of all, it says Mikadesh. It's talking about how God sanctifies us. So it makes sense to connect it to Kiddush. Kiddush, you start off with, right? You start off with Vayichulu, right? And you only end with a Baruch. You don't have a Baruch. This one actually starts with the Baruch and ends with the Baruch. The second bracha of Kiddush starts with the Baruch and ends with the Baruch. So is it like that? Is it like that? Some people say this is part of a debate. Also, do you view this, is it a bracha or a mitzvah like it sounds like? Maybe there's no mitzvah, though, to get married. And then they view it as a birchat hasheva, praising God for that he gave us a way to sanctify ourselves in this way. Okay, Tana Rabbanan, last line for today. Okay, this we saw already, 10 people all 7 days. Amar of Yehuda, and here we get it. Only if new faces came, people who weren't there before. And then my mevarech, and we'll see tomorrow what the nusach of the Sheva brachot are. Tomorrow is also one of these famous, very well-known dapim, because it's all about the different Sheva brachot and some other really interesting, the benching and all that, and all sorts of interesting, very relevant topics. So hope you're enjoying Ketubot. It's a bit different than our last Masechet, much more practical and also a little bit easier. Have a great day, everybody.